Welcome to Echoes of War. Secure your perimeter and stay with us. The mission begins now. Let's drop in. The helicopter was swallowed by the Arctic storm only seconds after the wheels left the frozen earth, leaving Captain Rayan Voss standing motionless on a jagged, ice-slicked ridge. He watched the blinking red strobe of the rear light flicker, and then dissolve behind a vertical wall of swirling white chaos, until even the rhythmic thrum of the rotors was strangled by the wind, replaced by a silence so heavy it pressed against his eardrums like a physical weight. The temperature had already plummeted below -25 degrees, and even though the night was still hours away, the sun was a pale, dying memory hidden behind a sky the color of a bruised lung. Standing beside him were 5 men in white camouflage, their forms nearly invisible against the endless, brutal wilderness of the north. They were Ghost Team, the Directorate's premier cold-weather special operations unit, deployed here on a mission whose true parameters had never been fully explained by the brass. Rayan lowered his night vision goggles, the world turning a grainy, glowing green as he scanned the valley below, a landscape of frozen cliffs and ancient, buried pine forests that stretched toward the Russian border. Somewhere beneath that impenetrable layer of ice and snow lay Krovna Station, an abandoned Cold War listening post that had been officially erased from government records 15 years ago, only to suddenly reactivate 3 weeks prior, according to ghost-like satellite heat signatures. The mystery of Krovna was the only reason Ghost Team was currently shivering on a ridge at the edge of the world. All contact with the station had vanished shortly after its reactivation, leaving behind only a single, frantic, encrypted distress signal that had arrived in a burst of static, saying nothing more than "don't let them," before cutting out entirely. Nobody in the Directorate knew who had sent it or what was currently occurring deep within the buried concrete of the station, making Rayan's team the scalpel sent to cut out the truth. Rayan adjusted the sling of his rifle and checked his wrist-mounted map, confirming that the station sat 8 kilometers to the south through mountain terrain that would be lethal even in perfect weather. He signaled for movement, and the team began their descent in a tight, disciplined formation, their boots crushing through deep, brittle snow while the wind screamed across the mountain faces, turning their visibility into a flickering, whiteout nightmare. Halfway down the slope, Rayan suddenly raised a closed fist, the universal signal for a hard halt that brought the squad to an immediate silent stop. In the valley below, partially filled by the driving snow, he had spotted a line of tracks, human boot prints, fresh and heading north with the heavy load patterns and military spacing of a trained unit. However, the rhythm of the prints was wrong. These weren't the steady, measured steps of a patrol, but the frantic, uneven strides of men in full-speed flight. When Malik, his second-in-command, whispered that it might be a local militia, Rayan knelt closer to the snow, his eyes narrowing as he studied the depth of the impressions. He whispered back that they weren't patrolling or searching, they were escaping. At that exact second, a deep, earth-shaking crack exploded through the mountain above them, the ground trembling so violently that Rayan only had time to shout a single warning before the entire slope collapsed into a roaring, white wall of destruction that swallowed trees, rocks, and the very air itself, spinning Rayan into a freezing, breathless chaos. Silence returned to the mountain, but it was an unnatural, absolute quiet that felt more terrifying than the roar of the slide. Rayan opened his eyes to a world of blackness, realizing instantly that he was buried alive under a crushing weight of snow that pinned his limbs and squeezed the very breath from his lungs. Panic flared in his chest, a primal urge to thrash against the frozen tomb, but his special operations training took hold, forcing him into a rhythm of slow, controlled breathing to conserve what little oxygen remained in the small air pocket around his face. He began to move his fingers, then his wrists, painstakingly carving out space in the packed ice until he could heave his shoulders upward, pushing against the weight of the mountain inch by agonizing inch. Finally, his hand broke through the surface into the biting, freezing air, and he clawed his way out of the hole, collapsing onto the reshaped surface of the slope while gasping for air that felt like liquid fire in his throat. When he finally managed to wipe the ice from his goggles and look around, the world he knew had been erased. The forests were gone, the terrain had been reshaped into a jagged wasteland of white destruction, and the ridgeline where Ghost Team had stood was now a smooth, deceptive curve of snow. He began to scream for Malik and the rest of the team, his voice sounding thin and hollow against the backdrop of the intensifying storm, but only the howling wind answered him. He fumbled for his radio, his fingers numb and clumsy, but the only sound emanating from the earpiece was the flat, dead hiss of static. A cold realization settled in his gut. Ghost Team was gone, either scattered miles apart under the debris or already suffocated in the dark. And the mission had suddenly transformed from a tactical insertion into a desperate struggle for survival in a frozen graveyard with no extraction plan and no command response from the directorate. Somewhere far below him in the gathering shadows of the valley, Krovna Station still waited, but Rayan was now a ghost himself, isolated in a landscape that was actively trying to kill him. He stayed on his knees for several seconds, trying to stabilize his heart rate while the wind cut sideways across his face with the force of sandpaper on raw skin, realizing that the mountain itself felt alive, angry, and intent on finishing what the avalanche had started. Forcing himself to stand, his first instinct was to begin a systematic search for his men. But the landscape was a treacherous maze of broken trees sticking out of the snow like snapped bones and unstable drifts that threatened to trigger another collapse. He checked his wrist scanner, hoping for a heat signature or a beacon pulse, but the screen only showed a chaotic jumble of interference caused by the magnetic anomalies of the storm. He was entirely alone, not just on the mountain, but in a world that no longer acknowledged his existence. He began a careful, agonizing descent, his boots sinking deep into the powdery drifts as he called out short, coded bursts into the radio, praying for even a single syllable of a response. After nearly 20 minutes of searching the debris field, he spotted a dark shape near a shattered pine. It was Malik's glove, torn at the wrist and already stiffening with blood that had frozen into dark red ice. His chest tightened as he began to dig frantically with his bare hands, but he found nothing else except for a set of heavy drag marks leading deeper into a nearby snow drift. These weren't the marks of a man being buried by a slide. They suggested someone had been forcibly pulled away after the impact, meaning either a team member was alive and moving, or something else had found them first. Rayan followed the disturbing drag marks into a narrow, jagged ravine where the cliffs on both sides squeezed the wind into a high-pitched, mournful whistle. But the visibility remained a treacherous blur of white haze and trapping snow. It was here that he noticed a new set of footprints. They were sharper and more organized than the panicked strides he had seen before the avalanche, suggesting a unit that was moving with a terrifying, predatory precision. He realized with a jolt of adrenaline that there were at least two different movement patterns overlapping in the valley, one group fleeing in terror, and another following them with the cold, calculated intent of a hunter. As he pushed deeper into the ravine, his radio suddenly emitted a jarring crack of sound. It wasn't the aimless hiss of natural static, but a distorted, momentary burst that sounded like a human voice struggling to break through a wall of electronic noise. This single moment of contact changed everything, providing a grim confirmation that Ghost Team wasn't entirely dead, but their communications were being systematically jammed by an external force. The storm intensified as he moved forward, the wind now screaming through the ravine like a pressurized tunnel of noise, dropping visibility so low that Rayan's own footprints were erased behind him within seconds. He kept his eyes locked on the faint impressions in the snow until he saw a dark, angular shape ahead that did not belong in this natural wilderness, a metallic structure partially buried in a massive drift. As he approached, he realized it was a collapsed vehicle or a prefabricated structure half sunk into the ice, and lying next to it was another body in Ghost Team gear. When Rayan turned the soldier over, his heart sank as he recognized Vex, but the cause of death was not the avalanche. There was a clean surgical puncture wound in the side of his neck. This was an execution, not an accident, and it meant that someone had been moving through the impact zone immediately after the collapse to finish off the survivors. Rayan stayed frozen beside Vex's body for a long moment, his mind struggling to reconcile his mission parameters with the cold-blooded reality of a cleanup crew operating in a whiteout. Ghost Team was supposed to be the best, but they were being systematically eliminated in the dark by a force that wanted total silence rather than a battlefield victory. He pulled Vex's radio unit free and noticed that it had been deliberately disabled rather than crushed, a detail that tightened the knot of dread in his chest as he scanned the surrounding cliffs for movement. He dragged the body into the partial cover of an ice ridge, not just out of respect, but to hide his own position from whoever was circling the impact zone. He identified at least 6 distinct sets of boot patterns around the site, none of which matched Ghost Team equipment, confirming that a separate team of operators had been inside the mission area long before the avalanche even happened. A low, metallic crack echoed from the ridgeline above the ravine, and Rayan immediately snapped his rifle toward the sound, though he saw nothing but shifting snow and the violent, gray blur of the storm. The noise was wrong. It wasn't the natural groan of shifting ice or breaking branches, but the controlled, mechanical sound of gear shifting or suppressed movement on rock. This realization forced him into a state of total combat focus as he slipped into the shadows of a jagged ice wall, scanning the terrain through thermal overlays that flickered and died under the intense interference of the Arctic wind. For a split second, a heat signature flared high on the ridge, a ghostly pale yellow shape against the cold blue, before it vanished. It wasn't alone. He tracked at least two more faint readings moving in a coordinated, parallel spacing to his own position, tracking him from the high ground while maintaining a disciplined distance. These weren't local militia or panicked survivors. They were experienced, highly trained operators who were intentionally avoiding detection while they closed the distance. Rayan changed direction immediately, abandoning the predictable path through the ravine to cut sideways into a steep, unstable slope of deep snow to break their line of sight. He climbed diagonally, every step threatening to trigger a secondary collapse beneath his boots, but he pushed himself forward because he knew that staying still meant being locked under constant observation. After several minutes of this exhausting, controlled ascent, he reached a narrow rock shelf partially shielded from the wind where he stopped to reassess his dwindling resources. He was down to a single rifle, a few limited magazines, and a radio that offered nothing but bursts of interference. He still had no confirmation if Malik, Danner, or Hollies were alive. Suddenly, his radio cracked again, and this time the signal was clearer, a weak, distorted voice that he recognized instantly as Malik's. It was only a single word, whispered with an urgency that chilled Rayan more than the temperature. Run. The signal cut out completely after that, and Rayan didn't hesitate. He began to move again, descending the opposite side of the ridge even faster despite his growing fatigue. Malik's warning wasn't just about general danger. It was a confirmation that a pursuit was active and right on his heels. As he descended into a thicket of frozen pine forest, he began to see more signs of a professional presence. Snapped branches at a consistent height and deliberate spacing in the tree disruption that indicated a sweep team. He stumbled upon another body hanging half-frozen against a pine trunk, this time a support operator from Ghost Team who had been stripped of all gear and weaponry. This wasn't the chaos of a battlefield. It was a systematic disarming and elimination of his unit. The storm had shifted into full whiteout conditions, and while the lack of visibility should have offered safety, it only made everything worse. He could hear the crunch of snow that didn't match the wind's rhythm, and at one point he fired a short burst into the white haze, only to realize he was shooting at ghosts. He was being herded, trapped in a controlled hunt where the enemy had engineered the avalanche, or used it as a perfect cover to isolate and erase Ghost Team one by one. The sound of his own gunfire was swallowed by the whiteout, and Rayan stopped firing immediately, realizing that wasting ammunition in zero visibility was a death sentence. He lowered his profile and moved deeper into the tree line, where the heavy, snow-laden pine branches formed a broken canopy that offered a slight reprieve from the wind. Every step was a calculation. Survival now depended entirely on his memory and terrain reading since his GPS had become a useless piece of frozen plastic. After several minutes of slow, agonizing movement, he reached a narrow clearing where the snow had been compacted into an unusually flat, circular pattern. In the center, he found a sight that made his blood run colder than the Arctic air. Ghost Team gear, stripped from his men, including magazines, medical kits, and comm units, was laid out in a methodical, clinical arrangement. This wasn't the work of scavengers. It was a professional examination, a cataloging of operational intelligence by an enemy intent on erasing every trace of their existence. He crouched beside the pile, his eyes landing on identification markers that had been deliberately scratched away to remove any data regarding their origin. Then, he noticed a fresh trail of blood frozen into the snow, leading away from the clearing in a straight, controlled line that suggested a wounded soldier had been transported rather than dragged. Following the trail deeper into the forest, he discovered the wreckage of a military-grade reconnaissance drone jammed into a tree trunk. Ghost Team didn't deploy this model, confirming that a third-party Black Ops unit was operating in the same zone and was likely responsible for the natural avalanche. He checked the wreckage and found the memory module had been removed with surgical precision, reinforcing the reality that he was up against a cleanup team that left nothing to chance. Suddenly, a sharp, controlled whistle cut through the howling wind from a higher elevation behind him. Rayan instinctively dropped behind a fallen log just as a burst of snow erupted exactly where he had been standing, the silent puff indicating a suppressed shot. He was no longer just being tracked, he was being engaged. He rolled into deeper cover and returned fire in short, disciplined bursts toward the ridgeline, but the enemy vanished as quickly as they had appeared. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was being herded. Every contact was designed to push him further into the dense forest and away from any potential open terrain or extraction points. His fingers were beginning to go numb through his gloves, and with only one sustained engagement's worth of ammo left, he was reaching his limit. As he leaned against a frozen rock overhang to catch his breath, he heard a soft, metallic click just feet away, and a shadow stepped out of the haze, not firing, just watching him. Confirming that he was trapped in a controlled kill zone, Rayan remained motionless against the ice wall, his rifle steady and his eyes locked on the figure emerging from the white haze, while the storm continued to tear sound apart in violent, uneven waves. The shadow solidified into a soldier wearing advanced winter camouflage, a high-tech plate carrier, and no visible insignia, confirming that this was an independent, off-grid operator group rather than a rescue party. The figure moved with a terrifying, fresh energy that suggested they had bypassed the avalanche and the brutal survival phase Ghost Team had endured. And when the stranger spoke, the wind distorted the words into fragments about mission terminated. Rayan responded with silence, choosing not to reveal his intent as he angled for a better line of sight, only to see a second shape appearing in the trees behind the first. He realized then that he was being actively contained rather than just tracked, and in a split-second decision, he broke cover and sprinted into the denser forest, firing a suppressive burst to force a separation between the two hunters. The pursuit became a high-stakes game of thermal and movement prediction, with Rayan sliding down steep, frozen inclines and rolling into narrow trenches formed by ancient glacier movement. As he moved through the ice-walled corridors, he noticed deliberate directional markings carved into the frost, military indicators that suggested this area had been used before for covert movement under the snow. He followed these signs, his boots scraping against the ice, until the sounds of pursuit faded slightly, suggesting the enemy was now anticipating his path rather than reacting to it. Through a break in a frozen corridor, he saw a silhouette that didn't belong to the natural world, a partially buried structure reinforced with metal, the unmistakable outline of a Cold War emergency bunker entrance. He understood then that survival had shifted from the open storm to a confrontation in confined darkness, where sight advantage would decide the victor. Rayan pulled at the frozen metal hatch, the ice flaking off in brittle layers with a deep, metallic groan that echoed through the wind. He lowered himself into the darkness, his boots scraping down an ice-covered ladder into a narrow concrete corridor, reinforced with steel ribs and frozen water veins. His night vision revealed shell casings, blood smears, and dragged equipment cases, proving that this was an active route rather than an abandoned relic. As he advanced, he was confronted by another soldier in winter gear who signaled non-aggression and revealed himself to be a surviving member of the team. The stranger whispered a chilling truth. Ghost Team had been marked before they ever touched the ground, and the avalanche was a deliberate tactical trigger designed to isolate them. Before Rayan could process the betrayal, sharper metallic scraping echoed from above, confirming that the pursuit unit had already reached the bunker entrance. They slipped deeper into the bunker's throat, the air turning heavy and stagnant as the emergency lighting strips flickered in weak, inconsistent intervals that cast broken shadows across the concrete walls. Rayan kept his rifle raised, his senses tuned to the metallic scraping sounds echoing from the upper levels, confirming that the pursuit team had breached the hatch and was now moving in calculated search patterns through the structure. Every step through the narrow maintenance corridors felt like a gamble, especially as they reached a junction where fresh scuff marks on the floor and a soft burst of radio static from the left corridor indicated the enemy was closing in. Choosing the right path, they navigated through partially collapsed security doors and into a control room where a single terminal still emitted a weak backup glow. On the cracked screen, Rayan saw fragmented logs referencing containment failure and external unit confirmation, chilling evidence that this facility was part of an active operational network rather than a forgotten relic of the Cold War. The stranger urged Rayan forward through maintenance shafts that were unstable and flooded with ice buildup, explaining during the descent that Ghost Team was being targeted by a cleanup force designed to erase all evidence of the operation. They reached a lower transit line, a vast underground rail passage where the cold was sharper and the air carried a metallic tang. The scale of the system was staggering, with frozen tracks disappearing into black voids that likely connected multiple hidden facilities beneath the mountain range. As they stood in the silence, a rhythmic vibration ran through the rails followed by the sequential flickering of red emergency lights far ahead, signaling that someone was remotely interfacing with the bunker systems to track their movement. Rayan realized the enemy wasn't just chasing them. They were using the facility's infrastructure to herd them toward a specific, predetermined endpoint. The tension between Rayan and the stranger tightened as they reached another junction where the stranger insisted on a descending route toward extraction. But Rayan noticed fresh drag marks and footprints leading toward a central corridor. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford, yet the mechanical locks sealing the tunnels behind them forced them to stay in motion. They eventually reached a reinforced bulkhead door that sat partially ajar, with light pulsing irregularly from within and the smell of overheated circuits drifting through the gap. From the other side, a single metallic step and the soft click of a weapon's safety disengaging confirmed that the pursuit had anticipated their path. With nowhere left to run, Rayan positioned himself at the door frame, his rifle steady and his heart hammering against his ribs, knowing that the underground hunt was about to explode into a final, bloody confrontation. Rayan and the stranger breached the bulkhead simultaneously, rolling into a command hub that hummed with the electric pulse of active workstations and flickering monitor feeds. The room was a structured tactical nightmare, manned by two disciplined operators who engaged immediately with suppressed fire, turning the air into a storm of sparks and shattered glass. During the brutal exchange, Rayan realized the enemy was herding them toward a central circular platform, a containment node designed to trap and isolate intruders. As the stranger neutralized one operator in a desperate close-quarters struggle, the remaining hunter triggered a system override, bathing the room in a blood-red grid of light and sealing every exit with a heavy mechanical thud. With alarms screaming and more units converging outside, Rayan fought his way to the central platform, discovering a final access panel that led into the station's lowest, most secretive level. They plummeted down a vertical shaft, descending 50 meters into a massive cylindrical chamber where towering energy capacitors vibrated with a low, rhythmic hum. This was the heart of Krovna Station, a core layer filled with encrypted telemetry data that had no obvious military purpose. At the center of the transmission hub, they found Malik, wounded but alive, frantically working to bypass a self-destruct sequence. He revealed the terrifying truth. The station had been monitoring something non-human beneath the ice, and the avalanche was merely the first stage of an erasure protocol meant to bury the evidence forever. As the facility began to implode around them, the stranger stayed behind at the console, revealing he was an original Krovna Oversight Unit member who had waited years for someone to finally transmit the truth. Rayan and Malik barely reached the emergency ascent pod as the floor of the hub dissolved into a void. The pod launched them through a secondary vent, bursting onto the surface miles away just as the mountain behind them slumped inward in a massive, silent collapse. Standing on the new, empty plain, they watched the sunset turn the horizon a deep blood red. The mission officially erased from the physical world, but the data successfully relayed to a secure terminal. Malik asked if the cost was worth it, but Rayan remained silent, knowing that the truth was now free and the world would never be the same. They began the long walk toward the extraction point as the Arctic night took hold, two ghosts of a team that no longer existed, walking until the ice became their home and their names were lost to the wind.